New York Congressman Dan Donovan has introduced the Unmasking ANTIFA Act. The bill is modeled after legislation created in response to KKK violence between the 1920s and the 1950s. Of course, at the time, members of the KKK would put on masks, go out in public, threaten, intimidate, oppress, injure, and even murder innocent African Americans. So the legislation was made to unmask these KKK members and prevent future violence from occurring, helping to guarantee African Americans their basic constitutional liberties. Well, it appears once again legislation is needed to prevent Democrats from putting on masks, going out in public, threatening, intimidating, and committing violence against their political opposition. So the Unmasking Antifa Act reads, "Whoever, whether or not acting under color of law, while in disguise, including while wearing a mask, injures, oppresses, threatens, or intimidates any person in the free exercise or enjoyment of any right or privilege secured by the Constitution or law of the United States shall be fined or imprisoned up to 15 years. Now, I'll be the first to tell you, reading the actual language of this legislation, the bill itself needs to be tweaked, and there needs to be concrete language as to what exactly constitutes a criminal act. Because wearing a mask, oppressing, and intimidating is subjective, and as we know from government, if you give them power, eventually they'll use it for reasons it wasn't originally intended. We've seen that with Lauren Southern. She was held under the 2000 Terrorist Act in the United Kingdom, and we saw that with the FISA courts created under the Patriot Act were eventually used and abused to spy on President Donald Trump. So before this bill can be passed, the language has to be changed to make it very clear what constitutes a violation of the law. For example, wearing a mask, can the left then turn around and arrest the bikers that support Trump, claiming that they're intimidating? There has to be clearly defined laws as to what constitutes intimidation, what constitutes oppression. That can be done, but it has to be before the legislation can be passed, because government is abusive. And one of the ways of which government is totalitarian is not by creating strict laws, but by creating subjective laws that can be used against political opponents for whatever reason those in power see fit. So I will say that the language needs to be changed and the law needs to be very clearly defined. But the language is not why the mainstream media is opposing this bill. And in opposition to the bill, the mainstream media continues to call Antifa anti-fascist. Now, dating back to the 1930s in Germany, it is well known that the anti-fascists are actually pro-communist. And if you're against Nazism, as you should be, that's great. But you should also be against communism, because communism is just as deadly, if not an even more deadly ideology than National Socialism. Hundreds of millions of people were killed at the hands, murdered by their own government under communism in just the 20th century alone. This simply cannot be ignored. Just like Nazism, communism is a violent ideology. It is violent to its core. But the mainstream media continues to call Antifa peaceful anti-fascist, protesting against fascists as they themselves use fascist tactics. And in the end, it is not what you call yourself, but the tactics that you use that make someone a fascist. We have seen Antifa use violence and intimidation to silence peaceful speakers on college campuses. Ben Shapiro, Milo Yiannopoulos, both Jewish, Milo Yiannopoulos openly gay, married to a black man, David Horowitz, Jewish, Mike Cernovich, and Lauren Southern, all of whom are conservative or libertarian, not fascist. And by the way, all people have a right to freedom of speech, so even if they were Nazis, you should oppose them with speech, not violence. But these people are conservatives and libertarians, and all of these people have fallen victim to Antifa violence when they have attempted to hold free speech rallies. Many of their rallies have been shut down by Antifa, who show up in masks, light cars on fire, throw bottles of piss, and attempt to beat people with sticks, including not just Shapiro, not just Yiannopoulos, Horowitz, Cernovich, Lauren Southern, many others, but the innocent people who gather, assemble to hear someone talk about politics that they might agree with or might not agree with, have been violently attacked by Antifa time after time, and Antifa has used oppression, intimidation, and physical violence against their political opponents to prevent political opponents from practicing their basic constitutional rights, just as the KKK did to African Americans. We saw at A Night for Freedom in New York, Mike Cernovich, Gavin McGinnis, Stephen Molyneux, and Owen Benjamin held a gathering where they talked about their political views. At the end of the night, one of the attendees at A Night for Freedom, walking home, going to see his family, was violently attacked by multiple members of Antifa and suffered permanent brain damage. That person will never be the same. That same night, Antifa attacked a cameraman who had attempted to cover what was happening. And we've seen Antifa attack camera people time and time again at event after event. People practicing their basic freedom of speech, their basic freedom of the press. In England, Tommy Robinson, whether you agree with him or not, that doesn't matter. We agree in the West to handle things with words, not with violence. Tommy Robinson and his camerawoman were walking down the street when 6 members of Antifa walked over with full black face masks on. They violently attacked Tommy Robinson and his female camerawoman. The camerawoman was thrown down to the ground, her camera was taken, and she was kicked while she was on the ground by grown men. Tommy Robinson was confronted by 5 members of Antifa, where he confronted them in a fist fight and ultimately hit the ground. Although I will say Antifa was very soft, because Tommy sure did give them a run for their money in spite of it being 5-on-1. Faith Goldie, a female reporter, conservative, not a fascist, showed up at an Antifa rally with a camera. Antifa wound up chasing her out of the rally, stole her phone, stole her camera, and threw her to the ground. Her basic freedom of the press, her basic freedom of speech, taken away through violence and intimidation. InfoWars reporter Owen Schroyer was covering a political event. I believe he was actually covering Kate Steinle's funeral, which for some reason members of Antifa decided to protest. While attempting to cover the funeral, and don't quote, I believe it was the funeral, but if not, the political event, a member of Antifa brandished his weapon and showed it to Owen Schroyer, using it as a form of intimidation. Under the Second Amendment, you have a right to bear arms, a right to protect yourself. It is a felony offense to brandish that weapon against someone if that person is not actively a physical threat against you. Yet nothing happened to the member of Antifa that threatened Owen Schroyer with a gun, suppressing his basic freedom of the press, his basic freedom of speech, his basic freedom of movement, and his basic human dignity. Just a week or two ago, in Portland, the Patriot Prayer Rally, a completely peaceful rally, was met with hordes of violent Antifa members who showed up in full face masks with clubs and jars full of urine. By the way, how pathetic are you if you're showing up places with jars full of urine to throw at people? Antifa engaged the Patriot Prayer Rally in violence, and as a video that we have, many of us have seen now, went viral, a member of Antifa attacked someone peacefully assembling with a baton, and this unarmed man dodged the baton, which was swung at his face, and cold-cocked knocked out the member of Antifa with his bare fist. These people aren't that tough. But again, they were using violence, intimidation to oppress the basic constitutional liberties of people who wish to talk about their political views peacefully. The only thing that makes us a civil society is that we can disagree but not resort to violence. And of course, Charlottesville. The media spun what happened as alt-right violence, which no doubt there were actual neo-Nazis there. There were actual KKK members at the rally. But again, in a peaceful society, we either allow people to exercise their free speech and we beat them back with free speech, or we have a civil war. And the fact that I have to defend the free speech of Nazis and KKK members means I can't use my effort where it should be used to criticize the terrible ideas held by Nazis and KKK members. Because with free speech, the best ideas will win. It's the same reason the KKK use violence and intimidation to silence the free speech of African Americans. Because they knew if African Americans could get their actual message out there, that people would realize that they were in the right, that they should have the same liberties as everyone else. So just like Antifa, who's on the wrong side of history, the KKK resorted to violence to suppress their political opposition. So Antifa showed up to the Charlottesville rally in great numbers, wearing masks, with shields and bats and jars full of urine, and the entire day, what should have been a peaceful get-together became essentially a war zone, which ultimately resulted in many people being injured on both sides being completely wrong in terms of ideology, and ultimately led to one person being murdered via vehicular manslaughter, or I guess vehicular murder. But the media doesn't report on any of this. The media has gone out of their way to keep the public ignorant about the violence and intimidation tactics used by Antifa. And it continues to call them anti-fascist, even though most of the people they're attacking aren't fascist. In fact, fascism is defined as suppression of your political opponent's speech and a partnership between government and corporations. That definition much better fits what Antifa is doing, since Antifa is funded by George Soros, among others, who, well, he controls a lot of the politicians. Can't you say he is the government? And the media, which is also largely funded by George Soros, protects and keeps the public ignorant about the violence committed by Antifa. And if that's happening, couldn't we say that Antifa is actually the terrorist arm of the political establishment being used to threaten, oppress, intimidate, injure, and commit violence against the establishment's political opposition to silence their basic rights of freedom of the press and freedom of speech so that the establishment can further implement its totalitarian agenda? Just food for thought. There is no doubt that this legislation is appropriate and needed. The wording might have to be changed. It should be better defined what constitutes wearing a mask and using it to intimidate, oppress, and commit violence against your political opposition to prevent them from exercising their basic constitutional rights. But with all that being said, make no mistake. Do not let the media tell you they are against violence. Every day they cover up for the violence and intimidation of Antifa is a day that the media announces they support violence as long as it's against their political opposition.